All right. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And welcome, everyone, to TME Presents, Delivering Healthcare Through Public-Private Partnerships. You've read the article, now learn the rest of the story. I'm Daniel Wheatley, Associate Editor for the Military Engineer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. Before we get started, though, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how best to participate in today's event. All of the attendees are in a listen-only mode for the presentation, but you can submit your questions for the presenters at any time by using the questions pane in your control panel. I'll collect these and we'll address as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please also submit any technical issues you may be encountering here as well. The public chat pane is for you to talk with other attendees and discuss the presentation. Let's all try it out right now by typing in where you're listening from today. I see we've already got some people ahead of me on the game here from Puerto Rico. Welcome, Patrick. Glad to have you with us. Originally published in the May-June 2021 issue of TME, Delivering Healthcare Through Public-Private Partnerships focused on the development and delivery of the Omaha VA Ambulatory Care Center. Faced with the challenge of procuring funds to upgrade an aging medical center in Omaha, the Department of Veterans Affairs turned to the flexibility of a public-private partnership to streamline the delivery process and optimize value. Public-private partnerships, which combine resources from both public and private sources and similarly share risk, have been increasingly leveraged by state and federal entities since 2010. They've been used extensively to deliver major infrastructure projects, such as highway and transportation improvements. And in August of 2020, the VA completed the Omaha VA Ambulatory Care Center as the department's first healthcare project, delivered through one of these partnerships. So I'd now like to introduce the authors of the article and today's speakers. Jeff Monzu is Vice President and Market Sector Leader, Healthcare in the Omaha studio for Leo A. DALY, and Pete Yakowicz is Vice President and National Director of Veterans Affairs Programs, also with Leo A. DALY. Jeff, Pete, thank you so much for being here today. You now have the digital floor, so take it away.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. Thank you for all the attendees for joining us today. We appreciate the opportunity to present our this project as well as the process that it actually took to achieve it. It's kind of a unique process that was developed for this project and the legislation accordingly. And so we'll give you some background today in terms of how that was actually achieved and what the ultimate results of that were. As Daniel said, my name is Jeff Monzu. In terms of this project, I was the Leo A. DALY project manager for our design team, led medical planning and the design team for this project.
And good morning, I'm Pete Yakowicz. I'm a federal program client manager and work specifically on VA projects. So I was involved in the early on development of our proposal and pursuit of this project. I've been with Leo DALY for 7 years, and prior to that, 33 years with the VA as a last few as a capital asset manager in Vision 23. So this project was really special for me personally as well as for our company. We have a few learning objectives we want to present today. It's focused on 4 learning objectives. We want to get you familiar with the legislation that enabled this Omaha project to happen. We also want to compare VA standard design and construction timeline versus that of this Omaha project, and we're going to compare the outcomes as well. And we want to discuss some lessons learned from the project involving the VA and a private sector entity that could potentially be applied to the future. And then also discuss some technology incorporated into the design and also used during the construction and demonstrate the impact that had on both the budget and the schedule for this project. So for learning objective 1, we want to give you some insight into the Chip-In for Veterans Act of 2016. It's actually Public Law 114-294. That's known as the Chip-In Act. And in true government fashion, Chip-In is an acronym. It stands for Communities Helping Invest Through Property Improvement Needed. So we'll just stick with Chip-In since that's a little bit easier. The 114th Congress passed this legislation in 2016, and it created a pilot program which allowed the VA to accept donations for projects that would occur on real property that either included an existing facility or could be used as a site for a future facility, or for the construction of a facility on real property already owned by the VA, which is the case for our Omaha Ambulatory Care Center. Also want to mention this pilot program was authorized for 5 years, and there's currently a bill before the Veterans Affairs Subcommittee to extend the legislation for this Chip-In Act. So the Chip-In Act allowed up to, or authorized up to 5 pilot projects, which allows the VA to enter into agreements with the following categories: either a state or local authority, a 501c3 corporation, a limited liability corporation, a private entity, donor or donor group, or other non-federal government entity. And in the case of Omaha, it was actually private sector donors who then formed their own limited liability corporation for this specific project. So it was an honor, obviously, for us, for Leo A. DALY to be chosen as the design firm for this project. Whenever you can take on a project that has the words "first ever" in the description, creates a lot of excitement. And if we're being honest, a little bit of trepidation on our part as well. But the project really went about as well as could possibly be expected. One of the reasons it did is that the Chip-In Act allowed the Secretary of the VA to waive VA-specific criteria, but as long as it still complied with federal criteria and local building codes. And so to their credit, the VA did loosen the reins a little bit. We ended up with sort of a hybrid set of criteria. Other rules about it is the project must either already have funds appropriated or at least be on the VA strategic capital planning list. Also, the donor is responsible for the due diligence, such as environmental requirements and so forth. And the donor provides all the funds beyond those already appropriated by Congress. So, you know, budget's always important, but in this case, the donors only had a certain amount of money to contribute. And by law, the VA couldn't go back and ask Congress for any more. So the budget was extremely critical. And now Jeff's going to talk a little bit more specifics on these issues here.
Pete, I think in terms of this project, you know, why Omaha? There was originally money appropriated for the project that was done. It was $56 million appropriated by Congress for a project that was done in 2010. That project was actually stopped and reprioritized in terms of where VA projects, in terms of the list of priorities. So there was a need identified for this project in Omaha, and there's a local philanthropic group that worked with the congressional legislation from Nebraska to actually get the act passed so that this project could actually, the funds originally appropriated for that project could be redirected for another project. And so combined with the donated funds from the donor, they were put together with the original $56 million to create the budget for this project. So to start that, to actually compare how we were able to achieve this project, when we compare this to what would be considered a traditional VA delivery model for a project of this nature versus what we did for this project, once that donor was involved in the Chip-In project, allowed for the ability to kind of evaluate the criteria for the project, as Pete had alluded to. So the PG 1815 was able to be modified, and the donor and the VA and design group actually met to evaluate what things were going to be kept and what things were going to be removed. And so you can see that these are just examples of the strike-throughs from the PG 1850. So mostly what it did is it affected the delivery timeline and the delivery criteria to align it more with what we would consider to be a private sector project. So the SD, the multiple SD submittals, multiple DD submittals, and so forth were cut down to the point where we had a concept submittal, SD submittal, DD submittals, CD submittal, more in line with what a private sector project might encompass. And so when you looked at that against the overall schedule for the project, this project was originally, the scope of this one, the VA was talking about an ambulatory center here. That process was looked at as being about 52 months. So 6 months for the acquisition for the designer, 18 months of design, and then we had 4 months for selection of builder and 24 months of construction. And the actual length for the Omaha project, the donor went through a selection process for the designers, and shortly thereafter went for an acquisition process for the contractor. So our contractor, this is actually a CM at risk type setup for this project. McCarthy Building Companies was a contractor, and they were actually, it performed more like an early contractor involvement. So they were involved throughout the length of the project from early design all the way through to the end. So that allowed for a lot of control of budget, scoping of project, and actually having the potential to get some of the specialty subcontractors on board early. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Ultimately, though, you know, that looked at about 30% savings of time overall. So when you look about this project, I would say, you know, people are wondering how this project fared from a budget standpoint. The reality is, I think it really became a matter of the overall schedule. So when we look at that timeline and the primary benefits that contributed to it, we were able to get started early. The elimination of multiple submission points reduced the overall design time, and the involvement of the contractor allowed us to have coordination with specialty subcontractors. So you'll see it's some of the imagery, specialty components of the building. They were not, you know, just a straight bid to lowest bidder type situation. We worked with specialty contractors and had some delegated design items. So that early contractor involvement really allowed for constructability reviews, timing, early procurement of items, which ultimately impacted the overall schedule. The senior resident engineer for the project from the VA was involved in the project during design, so that actually when you were going from design to construction, that senior resident engineer was involved in the project and knew kind of the decision-making process throughout. So the end result of really controlling that timeline, although there were decisions relative to design that controlled, you know, cost, the actual construction cost of this project was $67 million versus an original budget from VA for this project of $86 million. And when there was a conceptual estimate done by McCarthy from between program and concept, they set a number of just at right below 67. So we ended up being within 1% of the conceptual estimate when we were done. The actual overall project cost ended up being $86 million. So that's all fitted out, FF&E and everything, versus the original estimates of $120 million. Now, in addition to that, this is another question we get. So of that $67 million, the Chip-In Act allowed for the donor organization to contribute $30 million of that. So roughly $30 million of that construction was by the donor group. So the $56 million that was appropriated for the project originally covered that gap to the $86 million for the actual project cost. So some lessons learned from this process and the delivery of this project. From a QA/QC standpoint, that control of the process allowed us to use Blue Beam review sessions instead of typical doctor's checks. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Really had an evaluation of the FGI guidelines versus VA TIL in deciding which elements provided the best opportunity for certain aspects of the job. Constant communication between the VA and the partner organizations, whether that's the donor, central office, the main VA in DC. There was regular meetings with all those different groups to make sure communication on the project was open. And I think the ability to kind of select architects, select contractor, working with the donor group, there was a team chemistry of all aspects of this job coming together from the beginning. And then educating users on the process for changes was a VA add to this in terms of deciding when you're seeing a project, what's the actual issues that you need to change. And just because something is different, or it is maybe a modification of what they're used to for criteria, that doesn't mean it necessarily is something that has to change. It might be different. So we go back and we look at what was a true QA/QC process for this project. This project did not go through a Dr. Checks process. We were able to come to agreement to use Bluebeam review sessions, which I'm sure most of this group is familiar with. Those of you who are not, this allowed us at each of the primary submittal dates to upload a PDF format of the documents at that phase, and the VA reviewers could they had access to the same sessions. Session in here is basically an online access to the drawings. They could provide comments and markups that were then through Bluebeam sessions, they're categorized and tallied. And from a design team standpoint, we can go in real time and see what comments are there, and we can address them. We can provide an answer, an explanation for that reviewer. So it's not so much a comments are in and then the process is turned back over to the design team and it goes back. It's kind of live. So we could shorten, we provided a 10-day review period for that. And at the end of that, it closed for comments. And we were, as a design team, we could generate this report to all the reviewers that said, here are the comments and here's how they were addressed. And so that was done for each of the primary milestones. Now, we ended up needing to go through a training session with the VA reviewers at the beginning of this, but since that point, we've actually talked about this project with some of the central office VA staff, and the VA is moving towards looking at this as their primary review tool going forward. So regarding FGI and VA TIL, I mentioned earlier there was a modification or evaluation of which provided benefit. At the beginning of the project, in addition to modifications to the PG 1815, there was an establishment of what were going to be the primary codes that were going to be followed. That included evaluation of which VA design manuals would be followed. And for this Omaha project, it really said that the most VA manuals, other than ones for surgery related to med gases and stuff, were not going to be followed, but the typical NFPA guidelines for different portions of the project, the local building codes, and the FGI guidelines in conjunction with VA TIL for room templates, equipment layouts, room organization were going to be used. That allowed us as a design team to evaluate with users if we were doing a particular room, if there was a reason to look at a different setup than what a typical VA TIL room was going to be, then we had the latitude to do that. Now, we'll say we have this as part of the project, but that did not mean that we did not follow any VA TIL requirements by any means. There was I would say 90% of the rooms probably follow typical VA templates. But there were cases when we introduced a women's clinic, for example, and how it's set up. The rooms in there, they wanted to do a little differently. So they meet FGI guideline requirements, but they are not a typical VA TIL template for a women's exam room, for example. So related to the communication, as I mentioned, there were a lot of meetings with the donor group and the design team and the VA. One of the things that was of significance for this project was the ability to have this be more of an open bidding climate because of a lot of the execution or delivery of the project was controlled by the donor group and the organization between that donor group, the architect, and the contractor. So this was a meeting we actually had with the local subcontractor community, where a lot of them were able to come understand the delivery model for the project. And I think at least McCarthy would say this widened the bidding pool by probably more than 30% in terms of bidders that were willing to bid on the project, realizing that it was not going to be kind of a typical process for VA delivery, and so they had more communication with maybe design and construction team than normal. Pete, you want to go ahead and take over?
Yeah, I apologize. My mic was muted for a second. So we're going to talk about learning objective 4. We're going to introduce some of the technology used on this project to explore some of the unique aspects of design and construction. But we also want to focus on how the technology had an important positive impact on the budget and the schedule as well. So unfortunately, we don't have McCarthy Construction with us here today, but they are the contractor for the project, as Jeff mentioned, and we're a great partner to the whole project team. A big advantage for this project was that the private sector donors brought McCarthy on for early contractor involvement. As Jeff mentioned, that occurred almost immediately after we were hired as the design firm. So the ability to get their input during the design process was really invaluable for producing an effective set of design documents, while also being laser focused again on the budget and the schedule for the project. One of the things that helped from the start was that we gave McCarthy access to our Revit model. So they were able to keep abreast of our design progress, and really quite significantly, they were able to do real-time cost modeling based on the Revit model as it was developed and as it was updated day by day. And then we in turn were using our clash detection from our Revit model and even the virtual reality software to an extent to be able to look at avoiding conflicts of building systems and so forth. Another benefit of McCarthy having access to our Revit model is that they could do constructability reviews at any given point in time and always have the most recent design documents at their fingertips. So this allowed the team to make effective design decisions based on the immediate feedback that we got from McCarthy. Another great piece of technology that McCarthy employed was their subsurface utility mapping system. I'm pretty confident that no one on this call has ever gotten a set of as-built drawings that were 100% accurate. So with a facility that dates back to 1950, you're aware that there may be some surprises along the way. But the subsurface utility mapping was able to identify several unmarked utility lines on site, even a buried manhole that was there that we would have otherwise been unaware of. And luckily, their process even identified an electrical duct bank less than a foot below the surface. And we estimate that this essentially saved about $450,000 in at least a month on the schedule by not finding this unmarked duct bank, let's just say the old-fashioned way. Another benefit of McCarthy having access to our Revit model is they could do the constructability reviews at any given point in time and have the most recent design documents at their fingertips. This also allowed them to coordinate the work with all the trades in a 3D model. And then, of course, their team utilized drones, laser scanning, and of course, the virtual reality tool our team used to help walk the VA clients through the space. McCarthy also employed 360-degree photographic documentation of as-built conditions. So if you look at the image here, you see the orange dots on the plan set. Those represent locations of photos that were taken before sheetrock was installed. So they show utilities, structural support in the wall, etc. And then these photographs were a deliverable to the VA. So they'll always have this record to help them for future maintenance or renovation inside the space. I'm going to turn it back to Jeff here now.
Thanks, Pete. Real quick, before I go through a project overview, there are a couple of questions submitted that just caught my attention. Carl, thank you for submitting those. I'll give you answers on those. But there's a question about has a VA used the chip-in program elsewhere? When the chip-in project was conceived, it was set up to have 5 projects allowed under that legislation, and it had a sunset date on it. Omaha was the only project that was executed during that. The sunset date was actually extended at the end of that period. And there is a project in Tulsa right now for a hospital, actually a hospital project for the VA. It's a renovation of an office building for a hospital. So that's going to be the second chip-in project. And I believe they're looking at extending that. I think just recently, actually, it was approved to extend the Chip-In Act like 2 days ago from one of the House. I think the House extended that legislation. It needed to be voted on by the Senate, I believe. I'm saying that correctly, because there are other entities looking at potential projects there. But the initial 5 that was envisioned, Omaha was the only one that was executed under that initial legislation. In terms of veteran-owned business contracts, on the design side, we were the one consultant hired, and we had landscape design. There wasn't a requirement there. I know under subcontracts for construction, there were some veteran-owned small business entities that were involved with the project. I don't know what the construction requirements were, honestly, off the top of my head. I do know that when we go through some of the pictures, we'll show you there was an emphasis on the artwork for this project being veteran-centered. And so there's kind of typical VA artwork involved in kind of typical rooms, but all the public area artwork was controlled by the donor and our design team, and they are all veteran produced art or veteran direct, like an offspring of a veteran produced that piece, for example. So with that, I'll go ahead and I will kind of walk through this project overview. So I know I can't necessarily point so much, but this is a site plan of the overall VA campus on Omaha. In the lower left-hand corner of that is a conglomeration of buildings, which is the current VA hospital building. And I'm going to see if I can actually do some of this here. We'll do this. So the VA hospital building, nope, maybe not. Not going to work too easily. Is over here, and the parking lot to the right of that is where this building is going to reside. So this is a site plan and footprint of the new building. It was designed to be kind of front door for the overall campus. There's parking associated with that, and there's a separate project that the VA completed, like just recently completed, that there's a parking garage to the north of this. It was designed to have a connector back to the main hospital, and it's a split connector. So there's a public concourse connector as well as a service corridor connector. This is a photo that was taken during construction. You can see the building built out there, and you can see there's also a big space between that building and the hospital. There's a number of reasons that space is there. The position of this building allowed for connection to parking. It also avoided certain utilities and things that are in that back area, but it did create some distance back to the hospital. And so that comes into play for what the development of that experience was like for the public to actually access the hospital, because this really became the front door for people accessing the campus. So rather than this drive up here that you see in the lower corner of this is the main entry drop-off drive for the hospital. That remained in place through all of construction, and it still is the main drop-off for the hospital. Nearly all the functions that are in this ambulatory care building are functions that came from the hospital. So this is the floor plate. There's a ground floor. There's 3 levels to this. There's ground level, level 1, and level 2. The reason those are named that way is because this ground level, as we got down to the parking, it was lower. Level 1 of this building, which is the second floor, stay with me there, that level 1 actually connects across to the campus level 1. So we have a consistent level 1. So if you came from the hospital and stayed on level 1 into this building, you'd always be on level 1 to kind of cut down on that wayfinding confusion. So this is the ground level. It is the entry level for this building. So in the upper left corner there is an entry lobby area, and elevators and stairs. And then this building is set up very simply. The north You'll see that crinkle wall there. We've referred to that as the flag wall, which you'll see in some of the images. All the waiting areas for the 3 floors are against that wall. And then the clinics, the packed module clinics, are set up on ground and 1. Very systematic, very clear. All of their, I believe, you know, the wayfinding, the access to these are very clear, as opposed to most of these came from the hospital, where they would all be in different configurations. They were on different floors. And so this became a very systematic orientation for how veterans were to access all these places. The purple module at the far left is the women's clinic, which was not originally part of the scope of this project. Through design, the donor really wanted to push for that, and we were able to incorporate that under the scope of the project and the budget. And so there's a women's specialty clinic there, and then the rest of that floor is general primary care clinics. Same thing on level 1. This is the concourse connection. So when you come up the primary entry stairs, this concourse connects all the way back to the hospital. It is in a split corridor, so you have a service side and a public side. There are service elevators on the lower left here that are on the back. So this building very much operates in an on-stage, off-stage approach, where all your patients feed from the north side. There's patient corridors, and then there's a service back corridor and service access to all the clinics for the staff. The top floor of this building is a specialty care clinic, and then the rest of the floor has radiology and an ambulatory surgery center. So you can see the operating rooms on the far right side. Prep recovery zone is in the middle of that floor. And then that back, again, that corridor to the south of this drawing, the bottom of this drawing, is your service corridor that connects to those service elevators so that we have the ability to kind of get supplies to surgery. The connector back to the hospital is designed to be able to house have a second floor should this floor be something that wants to connect all the way back to the hospital in the future. So from a design standpoint, rather than planning, there are 3 primary drivers for the design of this project. Now, we developed these through design charrettes in our office, and with veteran employees that we have. We ask people, what do you think of when you think of veterans? What do you think when you think of the VA? And we synthesize that down to a few comments. We had meetings with the donor group, with the VA, to present some of our ideas, get their input, involve them in the decision making, and it really came down to 3 specific ideas, which was freedom and sacrifice, duty, and honor. And we had 3 specific design elements in this project that were executed throughout the project to really support those as the primary design ideas behind the project. So idea of freedom and sacrifice was represented by what we've called on this project the flag wall, which is the north curtain wall that is against all of the waiting room spaces. And so it's meant to represent an American flag frozen in the breeze, with the mast on the right where tighter crinkles, and it gets out to the far left in this drawing, which is to the east, where you have kind of wider waves. So when the building is lit, the actual floors and the lit space start to represent the stripes that are on the flag, obviously metaphorically, but this element became kind of a very strong element in terms of dictating kind of imagery in the project. This is a blast. This wall still needed to meet all the blast requirements of VA projects. So we worked with a specialty sub-consultant curtain wall manufacturer to develop this. We had a concept for this, and they helped work through, with our engineers, the design details to execute this wall. I think this is one of the elements, of course, having a specialty subcontractor on during the course of the project was huge in making sure it actually could be implemented. Duty is represented by a stone wall that runs the 2 lengths of the project that separate the public spaces from the clinic area. So this is meant to represent the dirt on the ground that soldiers experience when they're in different parts of the world, how that dirt then is tracked back to our local areas, but also as our veterans for Nebraska and Western Iowa come home, we have a very agrarian nature to lifestyles here, and a lot of them do have, agricultural backgrounds in terms of lifestyle. So that connection of dirt and soils from across the world coming back to where veterans are coming back home is represented by this wall. and its execution throughout the building tries to emulate the layers of how different layers are created in the earth, and represents that kind of safety separation between the public areas and the clinical parts of the project. You can see that runs down the concourse, as well as all the waiting areas, separating public waiting from clinical areas. And then the last idea of honor, was represented by the ribbon racks on service members' uniforms, and the execution of that as a design element on this project became the stained glass windows that are part of the connecting concourse. There's really the primary entry to the building, and then the experience as patients and visitors are walking back to the hospital. Obviously, during day versus night, it creates a different effect. It's probably more eminent from the outside at night, but during the day, one of the issues with this became that concourse really has a different experience as the sun moves across the sky and at different times of year. We do have almost 300 feet of connector between this main entrance and back to the hospital. And so there was really an emphasis on trying to make sure that space had an experience in it. And so this colored glass will help to implement some of that. We'll just run through some of the quick photography here. This is the exterior entry of the building. You can see how that entry concourse becomes kind of where people are entering from this parking. It's really has some significance to bringing you into the campus as a whole. And then that connector goes all the way back to the main level of the hospital and enters the main lobby. But it has access to all the main floors of the ambulatory care center as well. This view at night, I already saw that. The front entry canopy was designed with architecturally exposed structural steel, so that became a big element in terms of what that piece actually looked like. We had worked with a contractor to get very clear, very clean connections on that, so that piece was done very well, since it is something the general public kind of interacts with when they come in. Looks like that photo might be a little bit messed up. Some of the interior photography, that main lobby, you can see as the sun comes across and rakes across that stained glass, what the impact of some of that is. That the actual opening of the glass on the floor actually crawls across the space and climbs up the wall, and we'll have a video a little later that you'll be able to see that.
So you've already seen some of the interesting structural design elements, like the flag wall, the north curtain wall Jeff showed you. One of our focuses was trying to integrate design and engineering together pretty flawlessly, and not have obnoxious engineering features standing out. So one structural element that we had that goes really unnoticed is a support that we had behind the monumental stair. So we put a support there to eliminate vibration, so that when veterans utilize these stairs, they have a greater sense of stability and security. And that support was integrated into the design, so it's essentially unnoticeable.
So a couple of the interior views, there was an emphasis on trying to make sure that wayfinding for this project was very clear. And so there's a patient check-in area that is consistent on every level. So when veterans come off the elevator or off the main stair, they're on the floor. The first thing they're encountering is this patient check-in space. And then there's regularly spaced check-out spaces that are at all of the exit and entries to the clinics as well.
So one of the things, again, and this goes to integrating the engineering with the architecture, and we are honored. We recently received a Global Award of Merit from the Illuminating Engineering Society for the lighting design in this facility. So the lighting was designed to integrate into the interior design as well as the overall architecture of the building. And in this image, you can see the angled lighting in the ceiling space, and that mirrors the angles of the signature flag wall that we've been talking about. And then there's also strategic placement of wall washers, recessed linear slot lights, use of direct and indirect lighting, and they're all designed with a purpose, not only to provide a comfortable space for the veterans and their families, but also to assist in the overall wayfinding and the building orientation. And then we also incorporated some automatic controls that sense the passage of time through the day, and we're gonna talk about that in a couple slides here.
So this is an entry view to the women's clinic. They have a separate waiting area that is controlled. That entire perimeter of that clinic has security, a secured perimeter, so that as the other packed modules have access for multiple sides and staff, the women's clinic has one entry and then controlled perimeter staff entry, but it also has views to the exterior gardens. The interior staff areas of those clinics are all oriented so that we have access to the back wall of windows that look out into the landscaped area. So we're always getting natural light into those inner staff cores of the packed modules.
So as I just mentioned a minute ago, we incorporated a protocol of automated lighting controls with color temperatures in the clinic. So those of you familiar with the VA's PAC model know that there's a strong desire for the staff that work in those team work areas to have natural daylight available to them. So although the back of the team areas allow natural light in to filter through the south of the end of the building, it was important to have a balanced sense of daylight throughout the entire work area. So the lighting system employs the automated controls and color temperatures to give a passage of time through the workspace so that it truly emulates actual daylight patterns. And then we also reduced after hours lighting to create a nighttime presence, which Jeff showed before in some of those images. Also to enhance security, and in the end, it helped the building meet energy criteria for LEED Silver as well.
So although we've showed you kind of some cool aspects of the project, it also is a very highly intensive medical environment. So we do have state-of-the-art operating rooms to support the ambulatory surgery center that is there. There's a lot of mechanical and electrical coordination in those spaces and in this building. There's a lot of structural mechanical coordination for the systems supporting those. I would say that from a mechanical standpoint, a lot of the temperatures that these were set up to be were kind of outside of typical VA ranges. And so there's use of desiccant wheel technology and things like that to control the temperature ranges that we want and to keep the humidity levels where they want it to be. And we have ways for the operating rooms to get dialed back when they're not being used so that they're not taxing the systems. And of course, I don't have my mechanical engineer on here. She could explain that a lot better than me. Hopefully that kind of satisfies your curiosity enough. I know that there's a question Mark submitted about, can you define donor and who the donors for this project were. So I'm going to take a second here to go ahead and address that. The technical donor for this project, there was a LLC set up. It was a 501 LLC setup that was the Veterans Ambulatory Care Development Corporation. Basically, the primary donor for this was Heritage Services in Omaha, which is a group of philanthropists, we'll say, that regularly support personally a lot of community development projects in Omaha. So they've developed money for the baseball stadium that the College World Series is played in, a lot of you are probably familiar with. They've done the Holland Performing Arts Center, a number of community beneficial projects. And so they were very much behind this as a way to support the veterans from the community here in Omaha and Western Iowa. And so they were really the driver behind, in conjunction with our legislators, to get this project done, but they were the money behind the donor for the project. This is just a photo of the prep recovery bays that are associated with that ambulatory surgery center.
So Jeff showed you before the space between the existing hospital and the new ambulatory care center. And there's nothing in the original scope of work involving that 200 feet or so of space. So during the design period, as it went along, the donors started having discussions about contributing additional money separately outside of this project to create something special in this area. But then as we went through the design and McCarthy was putting their cost together, there were enough cost efficiencies realized in other areas of the project that we were able to incorporate this garden area into the project and still stay within that original established budget. So this was really icing on the cake, the ability to create a beautifully landscaped healing garden space at the facility. In addition to the therapeutic benefits to the patients, this garden ended up helping with stormwater management. All stormwater is managed on site, and the stormwater runs through the landscaped area which incorporates not only the healing garden, but offers a lot of vegetation, and it offers places for solitude and reflection. This is a view of the garden area from the east looking west, and you can, it's looking down through that 200-foot gap between the buildings. One thing to take notice of here is what Jeff described as far as the grade change. The high point on the site is where the existing facility is. And then everything slopes away to the north, and it also slopes away to the east. So we're able to use that garden area as a nice transition of space and the transition of the grade between the existing hospital and the new ambulatory care center. This is a view of the area from the west. We're looking sort of east-southeast. But the bottom line is that we were able to provide the space within the original budget. It's accessible to all patients at the medical center, and just a great bonus feature that we were able to incorporate into the project. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Jeff.
Yeah, so if so Daniel's going to run, we have two videos that are just kind of our photographer's compilation with some background. We're going to go ahead and run one of those with any questions and answers anybody has. Okay, and then there is one other quick one that just covers some of the exterior landscape areas. Public area, including that concourse, there was a huge emphasis on creating those spaces for veterans to hang out. You know, that aspect of brotherhood or family or whatever, that there's a lot of, as those of you who've worked in VA facilities know, there's a lot of veterans who go there and they have no appointment, right? They're there to be with their their comrades. And so the creation of a lot of these spaces for that to happen was hugely important. Unfortunately, this project opened last August in the middle of the pandemic that we're still in. And so a lot of those kind of group activities or ability for groups of people to get together and congregate has been, pretty minimal. So we haven't really been able to get a good sense for how I guess beneficial the project has been in terms of helping with those types of things on campus. So anyways, that is the end of our presentation. I guess we'd like to thank you all for joining into this and expressing interest in this project. And we have Q&A for the rest of the time. So I think we answered ones that I saw, and I don't know if, Daniel, you have other ones that have been submitted a different way.
I do. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Pete, for your presentation. Yeah, absolutely fantastic, and really appreciate you being here. So, for the attendees, if you've got any questions on anything that was covered in the presentation that you want a little bit more clarity on, or any other questions for Jeff and Pete, just put those into the Q&A tab in there. We'll be kind of taking some questions from there for the Q&A here. I'd also encourage you, if you want the handouts tab, there's the Pdh certificate and the slide deck available for download now, if you want to grab those and take a closer look at them. So the first question that I have for either one of you, maybe Jeff, this might be a little bit more in your wheelhouse, but really interested in kind of getting both of your perspectives, is how much was the VA involved in deciding the design concepts for the building?
So as I'm kind of, when I talked about the design, I said we started in office in terms of creating kind of a process to evaluate what are those elements that people think about when they think about the VA or veterans or service. And we have a number of veterans who work in our office that were involved in that. We had a board up in our office where people could include things. And then we had another session where we evaluated all those and talked about those. And then we kind of summarized those down into several, not the three we had. And then we had design meetings with the donor and the VA organization. Not so much, I would say, like open VA patients, like they didn't necessarily have a session open to anybody, but we worked with the VA organization there in Omaha and central office to develop, okay, what are the design concepts that we're going to synthesize this down to? And that's what we kind of came down to, the three that were there. I think the VA internally then had some presentations or discussions with patients in certain forums. I don't know what those were. And there was, I think, what I understood, a large amount of support for those as ideas, and people started to kind of, I guess, gravitate to those or take ownership in the fact this project was going to be developed with a lot of thought around of a focus on what is important relative to veteran status, veteran identity, and things representative of what the VA should be standing for. And so throughout the design process in terms of planning, the users of the facility, the staff, were part of the user groups to decide all the layouts, all the flow, all the typical work meetings we would have to design the spaces and how they worked. The VA was involved in that process.
And the other thing I would add too is, the VA had a large part. I mean, essentially, I think the deciding vote in where the building was going to be located on campus. Obviously, we had presented a few different scenarios for locating that building. And then once that site was chosen, of course, required a lot of coordination with them on, okay, how are we going to get supplies over? How are you going to transport patients back and forth and that sort of thing? So from that perspective, clearly they had a lot of input into those, not so much the appearance, but more so the function of how the building was going to work.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. I wanted to go back to when you were point of the discussion of the presentation, you were talking about some of the Bluebeam sessions and the fact that you didn't use Doctor's Check's review process for this. Do you feel like that was a problem, or do you feel like there was other concerns with from this separate sort or different sort of review process, or just kind of what are your thoughts surrounding that?
From my standpoint, I thought it went really smooth. I would imagine if there are VA members on the call, just because of the history of doctor's checks, there's probably some feelings towards them preferring that process. But I would say that the people that were involved with this project, that were part of the review, and even from central office, would be huge supporters of the Bluebeam sessions and the benefit that gave to this project in terms of streamlining that process. As I mentioned, we presented this project in national conference, and Jenna Williams, who is the project representative from the VA for this project, mentioned during that presentation that the VA is looking to implement this as their standard review process right now. Obviously, any big entities takes a long time to change, but I believe it went fairly smooth. I believe it allowed for a little bit more regular communication between reviewers and design team, and it allowed the process to move a little quicker. I mean, markups and things could be done right on the set of documents, and you could see exactly what things were being talked about. And it is a process that we use on nearly all of our projects, from our internal QA QC towards communication with our contractors, towards communication with our owners now, and I'm sure most people on the call probably do as well. So I think that had a huge benefit towards streamlining the delivery of documents to help keep this project on a reasonably fast-paced schedule.
Hey, Jeff, I see there's a question from Carl about the donor group, and I think Jeff had addressed that to some extent. It's a local group of donors who've done a lot of other donations for causes in the city. Jeff mentioned the where the stadium is, where they have the College World Series and so forth. So they in part were spurred on by the fact that the VA had a major project identified at Omaha, and then it slipped in the VA's priority list, slipped way down the list. And so they, just to help the veterans, they knew there were needs at that medical center, and the full amount of federal funding needed wasn't going to come anytime soon. So that local group got together to not only come up with the funds, but help spur on the legislation that ended up being passed.
Right.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to make a note, since there's a couple questions about downloading the Pdh certificate. I've just re-uploaded it to the handout section. So if you're having difficulties downloading that, please try it again. There is going to be a link to it that's sent out to all attendees as well, about an hour after the presentation. So keep an eye out for that. So hopefully everybody can get your credit for today's presentation. Let's get, I think, maybe one more question in here about we talked about some of how the VA involvement for the design concept, but what about like the medical planning and the layout? How much was the VA staff involved on that factor?
So they were heavily involved. Our user groups were the primary departments that you would imagine if you're doing a project. So the different clinics, the women's clinic, radiology, surgery, they all had user groups that were part of the design process. This project was done how you would do a typical VA project from the beginning, in terms of they created the PFD, the program for design. It was generated for the project. All the background, the numbers generation, all of that came from the VA. And we just, in terms of delivering it and working through design, our job was to execute that program for design to the maximum budget. And the the users, the local users, as well as department users were involved in the design process. Now, what was interesting is because we did not follow all VA requirements for spaces, and there were maybe some protocols related to mechanical systems and stuff that were not done, the facility was very concerned about making sure that, well, when they get audited by the VA or the VA comes in to inspect a facility, how do they tell them that, well, we did this project under this legislation, and so we didn't have to do that, or we didn't have to do this. And I can't think of a specific example right now, but there are those questions from staff said, well, we're going to get written up because, you know, we don't have 10 days of diesel fuel backup or whatever the case is. The building isn't supported that way. I said, well, so they talked about, and I don't know how internally how they solved this, but they needed to have information or paperwork that basically says this is the delivery model that this project was delivered under, and these were the set of criteria that were able to be followed, so that they have backup to the fact of, well, if the VA comes in to review this facility their own way to their own standards, it's not necessarily going to hit those in every aspect of the job. And this project is not deficient in any way for anything, but it may not follow the letter of the law for all VA TIL criteria for spaces, for example. And so they needed to have the ability to explain this part of this campus is developed under this legislation for when those kind of questions come up.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Pete, anything else to add on to that?
No, well, the one thing I'd add is, you know, Jeff mentioned they produced the program for design, and a lot of you know too, the VA has a prototype for using their PACT team areas, the PACT model, patient home, whatever people call it in other systems. So that was incorporated as well. But in terms of how all that was going to be put together and work functionally for them, obviously they had a lot of input into helping make those decisions and make all that work out.
All right, thank you. And I think that takes us just about up to our time and a little bit over it. So, so thank you, Jeff and Pete. Thank you for this wonderful presentation today. And thank you to all of our attendees as well for coming out and listening to today's webinar. If you're interested in submitting an article to the Military Engineer and possibly being invited to come on and do one of these TME Presents webinars, please visit our website with our editorial calendar and writer's guidelines. We're currently open to submissions for our January, February, and March, April issues. You can see the main topics of focus and proposal and article deadline dates here on this slide. Please also take a look at some of the other M.SAME upcoming webinars here as well. We cover lots of different webinars on different for our different communities of interest and national topics. So take a look at those, and we'll hope to see you around there as well. So on behalf of M.SAME, the Military Engineer, and all of our featured presenters here, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, David.